I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap, tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me," and "Don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up in the seat and just staring at the radio watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I recently called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" I got no laughter, just a pause. Because it wasn't alone. My grandpa owned a large herd of sheep, which during the summer grazed in the mountains in central Utah. In the 1960s, his sheep herder was a small Mexican man, we'll call Juan. Juan stayed in a very small trailer in a meadow while tending the sheep. One evening, Grandpa drives his truck up the mountain to deliver some food and supplies to Juan. As he nears Juan's camp, he starts seeing dead sheep all over the ground. Many of the sheep were trashed into pieces. As he arrives at Juan's trailer, he finds the door shut. He has to kick open the door to get inside, as Juan has locked it. Inside, Juan is curled up into a ball, mumbling incoherently and likely in shock. Grandpa picks up Juan, throws him into the truck, and takes off down the mountain to get Juan to a doctor. As he's flying down the twisty dirt road, Grandpa gets this terrible feeling like he's being watched, and sees something out of the corner of his eye. By this time, the sun is setting, and the light isn't very good. He turns to look out the passenger side window, and sees a creature he describes as looking like an inside-out deer, running alongside the truck. The creature dropped back out of sight, only to come bounding back even faster, running on his hind legs only. The creature then ran across the road right in front of the truck. Grandpa swerves to miss it, and ends up rolling the truck down the mountainside. Juan is killed in the accident, and Grandpa spends more than a month in the hospital. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington, New Mexico. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for the larger delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo reservation about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets the call for the job while he is chilling with his Navajo friend, Travis, and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got a family in Window Rock that he hasn't seen in ages, and suggests they go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was the summertime, so Dad decides we'll all go down together. He can do his delivery real quick, then while Travis sees his family, we can go check out Window Rock. We had to convoy in separate trucks, since my dad's was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some walkie-talkies so we could communicate with each other. We spend our time in Window Rock. Everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my dad and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of the Window Rock trip, but this next part I'll never forget. We're somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup, New Mexico. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the road was kind of slick, so we were taking it pretty slow. On the left of the highway, there is nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right, there is a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crest the top of the hill, and down at the bottom of the hill, we see what appears to be a very large dog, sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio. "Hey Trav, do you see that big ass dog?" Travis starts yelling back over the radio. "That is not a dog. Speed it up right now and hit it." He sounds almost hysterical. He just keeps screaming. "Hit it! You have to hit it! Please! Please hit that fucking thing right now!" So my dad starts to speed up, and as we get a bit closer, I can begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appears to have dried blood all over it. It's still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and looks at us, and it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than a mix between a bear's and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted and almost in pain. As we get closer to this thing, we start to realize it's actually huge. Though it's still sitting on its haunches, it is about shoulder height with the hood of a truck. We get literally inches from it when it lets out this scream that sounds like someone screaming as their lungs were filling with water, and it leaps backwards towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then, with another leap, it was gone from sight. Travis comes back on the radio again. "Holy shit, keep driving, we have to get out of here, we have to go faster." He kept repeating that last part. We have to get out of here, and we have to go faster. Pretty soon, we are speeding like crazy, and just as we start to come near the outskirts of Gallup, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us. Naturally, this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull over as well. Travis says, "We just saw a skinwalker a few miles back, and it's been following us." The officer immediately turns white, stammers something about a verbal warning, gets in his car, and takes off. We do the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. My boyfriend, a couple of friends, and I were on a trip from Texas to Washington. I had driven the previous 8 hours, so I was sleeping in the front passenger seat while their oldest friend was driving. At one point, I was sure I was having a dream. My mind said it was about 3 in the morning because it was pitch black through the windscreen. When I looked over at our older friend, I could see he was just staring at the road and driving, but he looked a little stiff. Outside the window beside him, I thought I saw a deer's head. But instead of passing by the window, it was staying in pace with it. And every once in a while I could see the flash of an arm, like someone was swinging it when running. Then I woke up the next morning in the parking lot of a convenience store. Everyone else was gone, except for me and the older friend. I asked him where everyone was. He said bathroom, and we just sat quietly until I told him about my dream. The more I told, the paler he got, until he looked me dead in the eyes with the worst look I've ever seen. He looked about ready to die of fright. He told me I wasn't dreaming. That when we were all asleep and he was driving, he had seen something pale in the trees on the side of the road. He kept going, thinking it was just a different kind of tree, until he saw something similar a couple of times after, until one of them began to move. When he looked in the rear-view mirror, he said it looked like someone was running after the car, but it wasn't falling back like he expected, and caught up with the car, despite us going a good 75 miles an hour. According to him, it was a man of average height, but from the collarbones up, it had the head of a deer. He tried driving faster, but it would still keep pace with the car. He tried not to look at it, but he could tell it was still there, and stayed there for a good few minutes before he got to a well-lit area of the road and then a city. He didn't have the heart to look in the rear-view mirror to see where it had gone. I don't know if he was messing with me or not, but he refused to say anything about it later. I don't know how to begin this. I decided to make this account solely to get help, as I'm afraid to ask anyone I know personally. I'm 24 years old, roughneck, working up in northern Minnesota logging. Yesterday, due to our bow hunting season opening, I've been spending my time out in the woods. I live on a very large plot of land near Ely, Minnesota. There are few towns over the population of 2,500 this far north, and neighbours are few and far. The terrain is unforgiving compared to the rest of Minnesota. This ties into my story. Anyway, let's get into it. I began by climbing into my non-permanent stand about 3 miles from my house in the state forest adjacent to my property. It was opening morning, all was on par. The sun was barely creeping out when I looked off into the woodlands and spotted something odd. A white-tailed deer, perhaps 40 yards away. The woods up here are so thick, I could only see the body and the neck. That's what confused me the most. It was sickly grey, pieces of dried, matted fur clinged to its bony physique. It looked like a piece of roadkill still standing. I pulled on my backpack that was hanging off to my left for binoculars to get a closer look. At this time, I had the urge to look back. I felt the back of my head vibrate, like literal vibrations. I felt a cold sweat work its way across my body. I looked back and saw the deer, now turned toward me. It was taller than a usual deer, but physically looked inept. Now I saw its head and antlers, and worst of all, its eyes. Its eyes, even from this distance, I could see were milky white, completely off hue from the usual brown-black of deer. Its head was disproportionate, favoring its left side with a bulging jaw. The antlers were unusual. Instead of the fresh new transition from velvet to antler, it was muddy green with an almost pus-colored flavor to it. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came over me. I've been through things I can't explain. I've seen people I care about die mere meters from me. This is the sole time I was truly afraid. I was making eye contact for maybe a minute maximum, blinked, and this thing was just gone. Almost as if I imagined it. I just had the overwhelming urge to run, which I did. I noticed as soon as I made it down with all my gear that the usual sounds of the forest weren't there. No birds, no squeaking of squirrels, not even so much as wind. It was dead silent and still. This was yesterday morning, and I've refused to leave the house today regardless of it being my imagination or whatever it could be. I didn't sleep whatsoever, and I had the odd feeling of being watched. It's the next night, about 9 p.m. I went through regular chores and fed the animals on my small hobby farm. As it began to get darker, I got a shiver, and that weird sense of being watched. I tried letting the dogs out so they can run and use the bathroom, but both my large dogs refused to go outside. Every time I tried to call them out, they run off to the other side of the house. Update, the next night. I went to bed thinking things had a logical answer to it, and that I may have been overreacting. I slept through the night, and I'm at work at the moment updating. Unfortunately, not all is as perfect as I thought. My girlfriend is staying with the dogs until I get home, and sometime after I left, she woke up to hear banging and something going wild outside near the chicken coop. As she walked out once the sun came up, something decently sized got into the coop and killed every last chicken. I originally thought a fox, but she said every single chicken was accounted for. None were eaten, just killed.